Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining our Master Gardeners Trial Talk Live presentation. My name is Nancy McDonald, and I'm your moderator for today. Jose Pazador, another Master Gardener, she'll be taking care of the chat questions. So just a reminder, if you have questions, you could enter them into our chat comment box during the presentation. And I'm very happy today to introduce Catherine Disley, and she's going to talk about Container Cultivation 101. Many of you who are on Facebook, Master Gardener's Facebook page, will be very familiar with Catherine because she's one of our very knowledgeable, capable administrators, and I'm sure she's answered some of your questions. I've attended a few of Catherine's presentations on containers. I always learn something, and I'm expecting to learn something today. So over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Nancy. Well, people garden in containers for a variety of reasons. You may not have an in-ground garden where you live, or you may choose not to garden in the ground, or you may be like I am, and I do have in-ground gardens, but I like to have containers of flowers where I see them often, and that would be at my porch or on my deck at the front door. There are countless options of what you can grow in containers, whether it's annuals alone or combining edibles and annuals and perennials. The choice is countless and it's up to you. As long as you provide the basics, your plants are going to flourish. So let's start with the containers. The materials that the containers are made out of are going to affect the durability and the plant performance. Here I'm showing several popular choices of containers. We have concrete or glazed terracotta. These pots are very heavy and they will crack if they're exposed to the elements in the winter. So you do need to move them out of the elements for the winter. And because they're made of a porous material, they will require more watering because that porous material soaks it up away from the pot. We have fiberglass, which are very popular, and you can find them just about everywhere. They're lightweight, but I find that they're not a durable pot. This particular photo was taken at the beginning of the season at a garden center when they've just arrived, so it hasn't even managed to survive shipping. Another popular planters that I see people using are cast iron. And cast iron, the heat builds up, just like your cast iron frying pan does. They often are only maybe 12, 14 inches maximum in diameter, which limits the amount of soil that can be held, and therefore they dry out. So in my opinion, you don't get good results trying to grow in these containers. I like to use them more as a decorative fall arrangements or winter branches, but definitely not for growing in. I will mention self-watering containers. They're very popular now and many people have good results. I personally did not have good results, and this is showing the inner liner of the ones that I had. And mine did not have an overflow that would allow excess water to drain out. And so what happened in mine is that it was essentially just a container that ended up a container with no drainage, and that did not provide good results. But what I do find very good, and if you're looking for pots, look for polyethylene. And polyethylene is a very heavy duty plastic, stronger than plastic. And these pots are weatherproof, so you can leave them outdoors all winter. They are crack resistant, and actually I could probably say crack proof. I have left some out 15 years and there's never been a crack being left out all winter. Many of them will be double walled, and that's what I'm showing in the middle top photo. And that wall provides a layer of air, and that air acts as insulation, which will help keep the soil cool. They're lightweight, so they're easy to move if you're bringing them up to a balcony or something. But because they're lightweight, you might need to weight them down. The tall planter with the fern in it, I suggest that you put rocks or something heavy so that strong wind gust is not going to send that toppling. So the size of the pot, well, with containers, bigger is often better. A large volume of soil promotes a larger root structure, which retains moisture for a longer period of time. So you're going to have to water less often in a larger pot. That's not to say that you can't grow in smaller containers. For instance, the watering can photo in the top right is shown using succulent plants. They're drought resistant. And if you want some flowers, there's the picture of portulaca, which is a drought tolerant plant with flowers. And with edibles, if you're growing lettuce and herbs, you can get away with a shallow container. But if you're growing tomatoes, especially, or peppers, you really need a larger container. A minimum size would be a 5-gallon pot, if not larger, because tomatoes and peppers, if their soil dries out significantly, you're going to end up with issues like blossom end rot. So whatever type of pots you choose, ensure that you have drainage holes. Because over the years, you may have heard, oh, you don't need drainage holes. You just put gravel in the bottom and fill it up with soil and you're good to go. Well, you're not, because what happens, unless you're very diligent in managing how much water gets added to your pot, the water level builds up and it starts creating anaerobic conditions, which is not good for plant growth. So if your pots do not come with holes in them, go ahead and drill many holes so that you have good drainage and your plants are going to thank you for it. The other important ingredient is the growing media. So do not, if you want good results, do not skimp on buying cheap potting mix. You want to look for the main ingredient being sphagnum peat moss or coir, which is a product made from coconut husks. The other key ingredients are perlite and vermiculite. That is what is shown, the white particles. And these provide airspace in the soil. And just like plants need water, the roots also need air, or they're not going to survive. So I'm showing a good quality mix compared to the cheap bargain brand, and it says that it has perlite in the mix, but you can barely detect any perlite there. So you know that it's not going to provide good drainage. Now, when I grow my containers, I like to mix in 1/3 of finished compost if I'm growing flowers. And if I'm growing edibles, I would up that perhaps to 50% compost and 50% the container mix. And what that does is introduce beneficial microbes to the soil, and it also helps retain moisture in the soil. And by doing this, adding compost, you can reuse it for more than 1 year. I actually get several seasons out of the growing media. So watering, well, how often you're going to water is going to depend on how quickly your pots are evaporating. And that will be determined by the temperatures, the sunshine that reaches the pot. Has it been really windy? Your pot size, as I talked about earlier, and the plant size. Larger plants are going to require more water, but you want to check your plants probably daily. You stick your finger down as deep as you can go and see if the water feels moist. And you want to water to ensure that the containers are completely saturated. And this takes time for the water to penetrate and get saturated. And my photo is showing a pot that I was quite sure that it was completely saturated. I had poured at least 10 liters of water slowly over this, and it was sitting in a tub of water to soak up. And I lifted it up and felt, oh, it's very heavy now. I'm quite sure it's soaked up enough water. I'm going to transplant it now. But when I took it out of the pot, I could see that the entire middle section was still dry. It's a light color, and you can see there's no water there. So if I had just left this plant, the next day it would be showing signs of stress, wilting, and then I would have felt the topsoil and gone, oh, it's wet, so I don't need to water it. So please take note that you really do need to be really diligent about saturating them. You will not overwater plants by thoroughly saturating them at one time. Overwatering is going to occur when there are no drainage holes, as we talked about, or if you're keeping your pots totally saturated daily. So people often ask, well, how can I stretch the watering time frame in my pots? And some people will buy the potting mix that has the soil retaining moisture gels in them. I've used those. I don't find them any more effective actually than the soil without them. But what I have found effective is using leaves. And what I'll do is start with an empty pot. I'll put a good quantity of leaves in the bottom, and then I'll put a layer of soil on top. And then I'll take more leaves and start building up a layer of leaves. So the leaves are going on the interior of the pot against the side, and I'm pressing those leaves tight against the side and packing the soil up around it. And then when I have my pot completely filled with the soil, I put my plants in. And once I have them planted, then I would put more leaves as a mulch on top. And it can be deciduous leaves, pine needles, bark chips, whatever you choose. But mulching your pots is going to conserve the moisture in the pot. It'll keep the soil cool. It'll also stop weeds from growing, and you will be watering less often. So fertilizer, well, if you've mixed in compost when you've done your mix, that's a form of slow release fertilizer right there. But containers are watered much more often than plants in the ground, and therefore the nutrients are leached out more rapidly. So it's advisable if you use a slow release fertilizer at the time of planting. And I'm showing hen manure as one example of a slow release, and it's an organic, or you can choose a non-organic method that it gets shaken in at the time of planting. And then every time you water, some fertilizer is distributed with your water throughout your pot. And then about mid-season, I like to start supplementing the fertilizer, because by that point, the stuff you put in at the beginning has been depleted. So I use a water-soluble fertilizer and mix it in with the watering can. If you happen to have these plant food spikes, I don't particularly like them. You're getting a very high concentration of fertilizer right where they're inserted into the pot, and it's not distributed evenly. But if you have them, you don't have to throw them out. You just dissolve them in your watering can and use them up that way. So plant selection, well, what you choose to grow, that's up to you. Choose colors and combinations that you like, but whatever plants that you do choose ones that have the same growing requirements. Specifically, you want to make sure they are the same light requirements and that they need the same moisture requirements. So here we're talking about transplanting hanging baskets, and you might say, why would I want to do this? Well, when you look at the pot on the left, you can see that I've just purchased it and taken it out of the pot, and already there's a very extensive root system there. And if I were to leave that growing in that hanging basket all season, it would start to deteriorate. It would not be getting enough water and enough nutrients. That needs more soil to grow more throughout the season. So what you do, and it helps if you have two people to do this, you take your plant out of the pot that it came in. And if the roots are quite plentiful like this and going all around, it helps if you tease them out a little bit so that they have a good time, easy time going into the new soil. And if it's a sunny day, you want to cover them up so everything's not exposed to the blaring hot sun. And then you take the pot that your basket was growing in and you fit it into the larger container. And if you firm the soil around that container, when you take that empty pot out again, you've made a nice little cavity that's perfect for the size of the planter to plunk into. This is where you would then sprinkle in your slow release fertilizer. And then you take your plant that's had the roots teased out a little bit and you place it right in that cavity. You should then be able to just gently push some soil and firm it around where it fit in. Oops, sorry, wrong way. And then the next stage would be to add mulch. And again, if it's a sunny day, it's wise to protect your plants from that blaring hot sun with some shade cloth or an umbrella, whatever you have, to get till they get time to become, the roots go into the soil so they're not under so much stress. And here we have the pot that was transplanted at the end of May. And then 10 weeks later, end of July, things are growing quite nicely. And I haven't needed to water probably more than once a week in my very large container. So maintenance on containers. Well, if they're flowers, you want to deadhead, which is removing the spent blooms so that the flowers don't start to form seeds. And that way you're going to have lots of blooms. However, if you're obviously growing vegetables, you don't want to be removing the flowers, or that's going to be removing your tomato or pepper. If your plants are growing a little bit too well, you can prune them to keep them bushy or in proportion, and then you can root those and share them with other people. Insects. If you think you have insects, please determine whether they are beneficial insects or if they're pests. You need to identify them first. We're all familiar with what a ladybug looks like, and we wouldn't harm a ladybug because they know they eat other bugs. But if you're not familiar with what the other stages of their life cycle is like, you may, in fact, be destroying your ladybugs before they're at a point where you recognize what they are. So learn to recognize them. I have a photo here of a leatherback beetle, which is a very beneficial insect. But when I didn't know what it was, I was thinking, is this something that's going to be causing a problem? Whatever the insect is, you do want to give time for beneficial insects to move in. They don't show up as soon as the aphids show up. You need to allow a few days and the beneficials will find them. Hopefully, if you think you'd need to do something, a strong spray of water is all that would be necessary. I'm showing Japanese beetles. They do not respond well to a strong spray of water. The most effective method for those is to hand pick them and dispose of them in soapy water. And just to learn whatever the effective methods of control are first for your insect before you start taking action. The other big pest that people have, and especially when you're living in the city, is squirrels. So I have found these animal repellent mats. I've found them at the dollar store, Dollarama. And what you do is if you're growing seeds, you just lay them down on the soil and the seeds grow through, which is shown in the top middle photo. Or if you have transplants to put in, you put your plants in and then you cut the mat. They're made of plastic. They're easy to cut. And the squirrels do not dig. They've got very pointy sides, so they don't like crawling on that. But if you don't have the mats, the other photo is showing plant trays that you find at the garden center. So these would have had the square pots come in them, and you tip these upside down and cut them to fit. And they do a super job of deterring the squirrels from digging in there, yet your water can go in. You would put some mulch on top if you wanted to hide the look of that. But once your plants fill out, you're not going to see that. And that brings us to questions.
Um, Yes, hello. We have the first question was about fabric containers, growing in those. Do you have any tips about that?
I personally have not used fabric containers. I have plenty of pots as it is to be using. I know that many people say that they have plants like tomatoes and peppers and things like that that perform very well in them. And they're supposed to be, if you need to move your pots around, you can move them in the fabric pots quite easily. But I haven't got any personal experience with them. But whatever size of fabric pot that you do choose, again, choose one that is an appropriate size to the plant that you're trying to grow. Like a tomato, you would want one that holds a minimum of 5 gallons of soil.
Yes, thank you. An early question, well, in fact, before you even started, was about regulating the moisture level so as not to drown the plants. I think you've covered that pretty well. And the main thing is to have good drainage. I sometimes find there can be a problem if we have heavy rains. Wouldn't that be nice for a long period? And the ones sitting out in the open can get very wet, but I guess there's not too much you can do about that. Maybe move them if possible to get them out of the heavy rain. Do you have any more comments?
A heavy rain shouldn't harm your plants at all. It's actually helpful because, like I say, having the soil get completely saturated is a good thing. As long as there's drainage. If you do not have drainage holes, then yes, you might have issues controlling the water. But one thing about watering that I will say is it's much better to water once well and ensure that everything is completely soaked than giving them a small dose of water or a little shower of water on a daily basis. When you water shallowly, the roots stay shallow, and you want the roots to grow down deep as they can. And there is more moisture at the bottom of the pot. So you want your roots to be going down where the moisture is and not staying up, within the top 6 inches or so of your container. So stop with the daily little, sprinkles of water every day. That's not good for the plants. Give them a really thorough drink, and you should be able to get many days in between the time that you have to water.
Okay, thank you. Catherine asks, would 50% compost, as you recommended for growing edibles, be good for wooden planters with edibles in? Would that be okay?
I don't think it would make a difference. Like your container is mid, so it shouldn't affect the growing medium that you have. So if you're growing edibles, then yes, the more compost, not more compost is better, but 50% compost mixed with that soilless mix is good.
Okay, thank you. And presumably you can bury the chicken pellets in the soil as well. That would be the way to do it rather than sprinkling them on top. Is that right?
You can do both. It's just, if you remember when you're planting your plants, I like to sprinkle some fertilizer down, where the roots are. And that way, when you water, it's often like if you put the slow release fertilizer sprinkled on top, when you water, you may find that it all sort of goes to the sides or whatever. It moves around. Whereas if you put it down deeper where the roots are, and then you've got other soil on top, it's more likely to stay close to where the roots are. But you can do it either way. If you forget, to put it deeper, which I've done many times, I just sprinkle it on top, and it does find its way when you're watering.
Okay. And somebody's asking how do you recondition the soil so that you can reuse it from year to year? Because you mentioned you used it for a few years.
Right. So I use it over and over again. So what I do is I will take out, well, I usually empty out my pots. I leave the soil in my pots through the winter, because what I do then is stick winter branches in it. So I've got a winter arrangement in it. But then in the spring, I will take the soil out of there, and then I'll repeat my process of putting new fresh leaves down in the bottom. And the leaves that were in there last year are already decomposing and helping, with all that micronutrients and things going on. And then you figure out the soil that came out of there, take out 1/3 of that, put in, you want to leave 2/3 so that you're putting in 1/3 compost. So add 1/3 compost to your planter next year, and you'll be able to replenish it.
Okay. And pine needles as a mulch, are they too acidic, or would they be fine for everything, for edibles too?
They're fine. There's studies that actually show that pine needles do not release a large quantity of, they do not affect the acidity of the soil. That's been proven to be a myth. I use them on my planters. I use them on my garden beds. I use them for my garlic, and they are very, very beneficial. I go around and collect all the pine needles I can find.
Okay, there was a question about protecting their containers from squirrels, but I think you've covered that pretty well, I think. And Kelly's asking, do you keep a saucer to catch overflow under outdoor containers?
I do not. What I will do though, is if I have my container on a wooden deck, I may raise it up a little bit with maybe a 1/2-inch piece of wood or something like that, just so that I have some airflow going underneath, so that I'm not, causing any kind of moisture problem on the deck and making a mark and stuff like that. But I don't put a saucer there. Again, I want the excess water to get away. I guess it depends on the size of the pot and the size of the saucer, that if you can dump it out when you know that your pot is thoroughly saturated and the saucer is not causing the pot to be absorbing more water than is necessary. So.
Okay. And is there any type of compost that you prefer? Mushroom, cow, sheep, homemade compost?
Well, I make my own compost, so I use that, and that way I know what's gone into it. If you're not making your own compost in your own backyard, then yes, you have to rely on purchased products. But yeah, any good quality purchased compost. Yes, you can use the manures and things like that, as long as they are mature composted manures and nothing that would be fresh at all that would cause any kind of burn and things like that.
Okay. And
this will be the last question, I think, Jose, the next question. Okay.
Well, somebody is asking for a guide to identify good bugs. I'm sure there are lots on the internet, but do you have any favorites that could come up quickly? You can pass on.
No, I wish I knew of a guide to identify good bugs. Usually what I do is, I learned last year to be walking around the garden with my phone in my pocket, so that when I see a bug, I can take a picture of it. And then I go to the internet and do a search, enter beetle-like bug with brown and black, and you'll come up with images, and then that's how I find them that way. So I'm sure there are sort of pages of beneficials. Actually, I know there are pages of beneficial insects that you can go to on gardening sites. I just can't think of any right now to tell you about, but yeah, looking on internet would certainly give you that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I was just going to mention, Catherine, that on our Master Gardener website, we do have a few fact sheets there that you and Marg, I remember, worked on garden pests and that, so they can check on our website as well for some of the more common pests. And thank you very much. And I did learn something else today, so that's perfect. And thank you, Jose, for handling the questions. And next week, if you join, it'll actually be me that's doing the talk on talking about color, painting with blooms or with perennials in your garden. So thank you so much, and we will see you next week. And any questions that were left, don't be afraid to send it to our email helpline. We're there to answer 24 hours a day. Bye-bye.